A property in Western Australia once sold for more than $800,000 during the height of the mining boom. Today, however, that same home is valued at roughly $340,000. The owner cannot sell the property without sacrificing their entire life savings. Yet staying is equally impossible because the jobs that once supported the local economy have disappeared. What makes the situation even more alarming is that the places locals are now warning people about are not merely forgotten outback towns. Surprisingly, they include locations such as Byron Bay, Noosa, and Alice Springs, destinations that are still widely marketed as idyllic paradise. Yet residents increasingly summarize their advice in three blunt words: turn around now. Behind these warnings lies a pattern that no real estate listing ever highlights. It begins with job losses, which trigger a decline in population. That drop in residents crushes housing demand, discourages new investment, and ultimately accelerates economic collapse even further. The cycle feeds on itself in what can only be described as a death spiral. Once such a process begins, it rarely reverses. At present, this pattern can be seen unfolding in 12 different locations, grouped across 4 distinct categories. Some towns are places where buyers will be priced out entirely. Others are areas where people become financially trapped. There are towns where safety gradually disappears. And finally, there are places where the land itself seems to be turning against those who live there. With each chapter, the situation grows more severe. Ironically, the most dangerous locations on this list are not the cheapest. In fact, the first 2 are among the most expensive real estate markets in the country, and that extreme price growth is precisely what is destroying them. In Byron Bay, the median house price more than doubled within a single decade, reaching a peak of approximately $3.3 million in 2022. Even after easing to about $2.1 million, a simple 3-bedroom house still costs well over $1.5 million. To put that into perspective, the typical Australian household income would have to triple before an average family could comfortably manage the mortgage payments on a modest home in Byron Bay. One yoga instructor who had lived there for 10 years summed up the change bluntly. The original atmosphere and tight-knit community have vanished, replaced instead by influencers and wealthy outsiders. Short-term rental platforms have devoured the housing supply. Streets that once housed long-term residents now rotate through weekend Airbnb guests. Restaurants and cafes have begun reducing their operating days, not because demand for food and coffee has declined, but because the employees who prepare meals and serve customers cannot afford to live nearby. The paradox is striking. The very desirability that pushed Byron Bay's property prices sky high is simultaneously destroying the qualities that once made the town attractive. Restaurants close because chefs have nowhere to sleep, and surf shops shut their doors because employees face 2-hour commutes in each direction. What remains is essentially a postcard image of a town, but with no one left behind the counter. The hinterland surrounding Noosa reveals a similar story, though expressed slightly differently. During the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, remote workers and affluent newcomers flooded the region. Many bought long-term rentals and converted them into short-stay holiday properties. As a result, teachers, nurses, aged care workers, and other essential members of the community were priced out and forced to relocate. Without significant policy reform, these once thriving areas risked becoming empty resort shells, lovely for a weekend visit, but unsustainable as genuine communities where people build careers, raise children, and grow old. If Byron Bay and Noosa represent places where residents are priced out, the next group of towns illustrates something potentially worse: locations where people become financially trapped. During the mining boom, Karata saw its median house price soar beyond $800,000. When the boom collapsed, prices plunged to roughly $340,000, wiping out around 60% of household wealth in what felt like an overnight correction. The victims were not reckless speculators, but ordinary residents, teachers, tradespeople, and young couples, who purchased homes during what appeared to be a period of permanent prosperity. Many woke up to discover their mortgages exceeded the value of their houses, a situation known as negative equity. Selling would require writing a check just to close the deal. Yet the cruelty of the situation deepens because rents in the region have since climbed to some of the highest levels in regional Australia. Housing stress strikes both during the boom and during the bust. People cannot afford to buy when prices rise, and they cannot afford to sell when prices collapse. A comparable story unfolded in Gladstone. The LNG construction surge of the early 2000s created tens of thousands of temporary jobs and pushed the population towards 67,000 residents. At its peak in 2014, approximately 6,600 non-resident workers were living there. However, once construction ended and operations shifted to smaller, permanent workforces, the demand vanished almost overnight. Population numbers dropped, classrooms and local schools emptied, and shops along the main street gradually shut down. The boom had not truly built a sustainable town. It had simply inflated a balloon that eventually burst. The pattern repeats itself in several other company-dependent towns. Moranbah thrived during the coal boom, yet the rise of the fly-in, fly-out workforce hollowed it out internally. Families who once lived permanently in the town were replaced by rotating workers whose real lives remained in cities such as Brisbane or on the Gold Coast. Local schools lost enrollment, businesses lost steady customers, pubs grew quieter, sports clubs struggled to gather enough players, and bakeries shut their doors because regular patrons no longer lived nearby. When a town becomes dominated by fly-in, fly-out labor, it ceases to function as a community and instead resembles a work camp with a postcode, a place where workers arrive temporarily, complete their shifts, and leave again. Another mining town, Mount Isa, faces a different but equally serious challenge: water. Its main supply, Lake Mandara, reached dangerously low levels after the driest period recorded since 1967. Climate change is making droughts more frequent and more severe, while mining operations require enormous amounts of water. If a severe drought were to occur, the town could simultaneously face water restrictions and mine shutdowns. When a community's only major industry depends heavily on water in an increasingly dry climate, the future becomes less a plan and more a gamble. Meanwhile, Whyalla finds itself trapped between two economic eras. Traditional industries such as coal and gas are declining as Australia moves toward decarbonization. Although governments have promised green investment in hydrogen and renewable energy, large-scale factories and employment opportunities have yet to appear at the speed the town requires. The result is a community caught between a fading economy and a new one that has not fully arrived, watching skilled workers depart for regions that have already completed the transition. Perhaps the slowest version of this decline can be observed in Broken Hill. The town's population peaked at nearly 27,000 in 1933, but today it sits just above 16,000, representing a decline that has stretched across 9 decades. In October 2024, a single storm destroyed 7 transmission towers, leaving the entire city without electricity. Broken Hill has also struggled historically with a water supply that rarely meets its needs reliably. Younger residents leave for coastal opportunities and seldom return. The median age steadily increases, and census after census records fewer private dwellings. The abandonment of homes has unfolded slowly but relentlessly for decades. Up to this point, the story has largely been about economics. Prices rising too high, prices falling too low, and industries disappearing. Yet the next category reveals a different loss: the sense of personal safety. In Alice Springs, often romanticized for its red desert scenery and tourism connected to Uru, reality has grown harsher. Years of rising youth crime and property offenses forced authorities to impose emergency curfews preventing anyone under 18 from entering the central business district at night. During a single 2-week curfew period, police interacted with hundreds of young people. Governments argued publicly about whether the measures were effective. Alcohol restrictions managed to reduce consumption by only 26%, while nearly 3/4 of people found ways to bypass the rules. The deeper causes, intergenerational trauma, poverty, and severe overcrowding, remain unresolved. As a result, many families with the resources to relocate have already left. A somewhat similar combination of pressures has affected Townsville. The city once promoted itself as a thriving tropical hub with a promising future. Then the catastrophic 2019 flood struck, submerging entire neighborhoods and forcing thousands of residents to strip their homes down to the frames. Insurance premiums skyrocketed afterward, with some households reporting annual costs rising from $2,000 to $8,000 or more. At the same time, repeated headlines about youth crime added further anxiety. Residents now face a triple burden: the financial strain of soaring insurance, the risk of rising crime, and the certainty that another severe flood is not a matter of if, but when. Many people explain that no single factor drove them away. Rather, it was the accumulation of all three pressures simultaneously. When families and skilled workers depart due to crime or instability, another dangerous cycle begins. The tax base shrinks, political motivation to fund long-term solutions fades, and the perception that the town is unmanageable spreads. This perception alone can accelerate decline even further. Finally, there are places where the threat comes not from economics or crime, but from nature itself. In Lismore, floodwaters during 2022 rose more than 2 meters above the previous 1-in-100-year benchmark. The disaster exceeded every prediction. Then, astonishingly, another flood struck only weeks later. The combined events produced Australia's costliest insured natural disaster, generating more than 242,000 insurance claims and approximately $6.4 billion in losses. Entire neighborhoods were submerged to rooftop level, leaving mud lines on walls where water had touched ceilings and cars piled atop one another like discarded toys. Yet the true catastrophe emerged afterward. A 2024 community outreach study found that about 2/3 of residents in the affected areas still lacked flood insurance, not by choice, but because premiums had become unaffordable. Many homeowners faced an impossible choice: rebuild and risk another uninsured disaster, or abandon properties that might never sell. A slower environmental squeeze is unfolding around Mildura and the broader Murray-Darling Basin. This vast agricultural region relies heavily on irrigation, yet climate projections indicate a future that will be both hotter and drier by mid-century. More frequent droughts, declining water inflows, and rising temperatures threaten the long-term viability of farming communities. Permanent crops, such as grapes and citrus, economic foundations of towns like Mildura, require years to establish and decades to reach full production. Planting a vineyard today effectively bets that water will remain affordable and accessible in 2040. Increasingly, fewer farmers are willing to take that gamble. This kind of decline does not happen overnight. Instead, it unfolds gradually across a generation. Each year, the financial margins shrink a little more. Fewer young families arrive, more orchards lie fallow, and long-time farming households quietly sell their land and move away. The result across all these places is what might be called a two-tier trap. In cities such as Sydney, buying a home is nearly impossible due to soaring prices. In towns like Karata, selling is equally impossible because property values have collapsed. In Byron Bay, essential workers cannot afford to remain, and in Lismore, the environment itself is urging residents to leave. The gap between these two tiers continues widening every year. Real estate advertisements still describe several of these regions as undervalued opportunities. Yet when local residents themselves urge newcomers to turn around, that warning should not be dismissed as market pessimism. It is a signal. The crucial question when considering a cheap listing or a dream coastal lifestyle is not simply whether someone can afford the house. The real question is whether they can afford to become trapped there. Across these 12 locations, versions of the same pattern appear: paradises where residents are priced out, resource towns caught in post-boom traps, communities struggling with crime spirals, and regions confronting environmental collapse. The symptoms differ, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. Job losses trigger population decline, demand collapses, investment disappears, and the downward spiral accelerates. Once this pattern becomes visible, it can be recognized far beyond Australia. Spotting it before becoming part of it may be the difference between making a wise decision and experiencing the worst financial mistake of a lifetime.